Yep, so thanks very much for the invitation. So today my talk is going to be a bit of a mix of both personal and professional stuff. And that is because after having gone to many of these talks over the years, I just personally find it very interesting, yes, to talk about research, because that's what kind of brings us all together, but also just to talk about the people who do the research. What are our backstories? Who are we? So I think that humanizes everything a little bit and makes it, when I was first starting out in my career, I used to get extremely intimidated by anyone who was called professor who was coming to talk about stuff. But now that I'm kind of on the other side of that, I've realized that we're all just people. So I like to talk about and share a little bit of the story, just to so everything's more relatable. And I also think that it's really important from a positionality standpoint. So as in epidemiology, and I can say this because I am one, we are, I think, rubbish at recognizing how who we are shapes the kind of objective questions that we ask and quantitative analyses that we do. So important to kind of realize who we are and where we're coming from. So my talk today is a little bit about my backstory, then talking a bit about some research that myself and my group have done over the years. So that's looking a little bit at the prevalence of violence, a bit at intervention research, so what can we do about it? And then looking at kind of more methodological aspects, particularly around ethics and safety. So how do we collect these data in a safe way? And then I want to talk about future directions. Except during that bit, I don't want to talk. I want to talk to you and engage with everybody here, because I know we've got a lot of experience and some really big people in the field. So I'm very curious what you guys think, and I'd love to just have a discussion about what we think the kind of big questions are going forward. Okay, and I always put a trigger warning, always since I met Amia and Anya, who I don't know, she's not here today. But this talk does contain stuff about violence. So just a bit of a trigger warning and reminder to look out for yourself. And if you need to step out, I will not take it personally. Okay. So a little bit about me and how I came to work on this topic of violence. And I am not at all one of those people that had any sort of grand master plan about my life and career. So it's a bit of a product of chance and also of interest. So you might be able to tell from my accent, but I was not born in the UK. I'm from Canada originally. And I grew up on the very, very far west coast of Canada. So like as far from London geographically as you can probably get. And my family is very working class. So given my background, it was not at all a foregone conclusion that I would leave my village, that I'd end up in London, or that I'd end up at university, full stop. So this remote village, how did I start there? It is because my parents were part of a wave of hippie migrants who loaded up their VW van in the 1960s. And at that time, my country had just finished building a motorway that spanned across the whole breadth of the country. So lots of disaffected young people, including my parents, were kind of packing up and driving as far away from civilization as they could go. So mine literally ended up at the end of the highway, which was in this village of Tofino. And that village of Tofino's population 1,000 people. It is in the traditional territory of the New Chalmers people, who are the indigenous people that live in the surrounding area. So in Canada, most remote villages are the economies rely on industry. So it's logging, fishing, mining. They tend to be more politically conservative. But my hippie village was a little bit different. So there was just a bit of a different kind of ethos. There was actually a Guardian article about it, and that's just a headline saying that we attracted draft dodgers, surfers, and wilderness freaks, which kind of, when I think back on it, that comprises my parents' friends. Actually. So yeah, differently to other remote villages in Canada, there was a lot of just general kind of interest in social justice. There was lots of debates about land use at the time and the environment. And our hippie village was actually the site of protests against logging of the old growth rainforest, which was happening kind of en masse around the area. And so, true to my upbringing, as a teenager, I was involved in some minor civil disobedience. So we protested against the logging by blocking the road. And this is, I find this so funny, also coming from a small village, it's like a picture of colleagues in civil disobedience and the police who were there to take us away. But it's like, that's also my mate's dad. Because it's, it's a small place, so people have multiple kind of identities. Yeah. So I think for me, growing up in this place and this kind of atmosphere, it really made me interested in social justice, in our social world, and ideas about rights, and also activism and protest, I think, which shaped my later research interests. So that was my early teenagehood. In my late teens, I was starting to think about like, what's next for me? And most others in my village were staying in town, doing jobs in tourism or fishing. There were a few people going off to university, but so it wasn't unheard of, but it was definitely not a well-trodden path. And I've put this picture up here. You can see the beautiful scenery in the background. This is where I come from. And this guy who's getting barreled on this wave, that is my younger brother. So we like to joke about this because somehow his career choice, which was to become a professional surfer, and he's actually been very successful at this, this was understood much more in the context of our village as a kind of a good and acceptable thing to do with one's life. And yeah, my choice to go off to the city, to move to a dirty and polluted place and to get a kind of regular job to go to university was really, given that context, viewed as something like super alien and weird to do. So I like to say that I am the rebel and the black sheep of our family. Yeah. So my unusual career path started in Vancouver. So I moved from my village of 1,000, which is about 6 hours travel overland from Vancouver. I moved to university where the population of my student halls was 1,000 people. So it was a massive, massive change. And there I did my first degree, which was in cell biology and genetics. And I came out of that thinking, I don't want to do this anymore. Don't want to work in a lab. But yeah, luckily I'd also done a double major in psychology. So I managed to get my first research gig linked more to that training, which was at the BC Centre of Excellence for Women's Health. And I actually found my badge from 2003. So that's me at my first research job. And it was at this time I was mentored by lots of lovely ladies, but also met the woman on the far right of the slide, Deborah Schwartz, who is of Métis heritage and was a special advisor for Aboriginal health in my province back home in Canada. And I kind of became her assistant and followed her through various different roles that she occupied. And through her, I really learned a whole lot more about the health of Indigenous people in Canada, and also the role of our colonial history and present in shaping that health. So that's kind of that interest and that partnership actually continued into my PhD. So after my undergrad, I was like, okay, now what am I going to do? I think graduate school looks like a good option. So I applied to a bunch of places, and London School came back with a yes. And I was like, okay, coming from North America, as everybody knows, I think PhD programs there are, what is it, like 8 years, a really long time. London School was like yes, 3 years. And I was like, right, I'm going to take that one. So yeah, I moved to London School and did my PhD, continuing to collaborate with Deborah back at home. And that was actually focused on the sexual health of Indigenous young people. And that was the point at which violence and violence research kind of first peaked in my consciousness. So my PhD, it was actually mixed methods. I'm finding this is a common thing among social epidemiologists. I think a lot of us have mixed methods training and background. But yeah, during my PhD, this is one of the quantitative papers up there, but the qualitative study, I was asking young people to talk to me about their experiences of condom use and non-use and sort of, what are the facilitators and barriers, etc. And through this work, lots and lots of stories of sexual coercion and sexual violence started to come out, which in retrospect is not surprising at all, but for me at the time wasn't so much on my radar. So it was that qualitative research and speaking to people that really kind of made me think, ooh, this is something I didn't set out to investigate, but actually it's coming up all over the place. And I think this is like a massive and hidden problem. So for me, my interest was piqued in violence. Towards the end of my PhD, there's graduation there. That was in 2007, and I was needing a job. And again, I did not have much of a master plan, but I had a best friend who was also working in a different part of London School. She was like, I have a really nice boss. Why don't you come and work over here? So I approached that nice boss, who was Charlotte Watts, and we applied for postdoc funding for me and got it. So I then moved over to properly start work on violence. And Charlotte Watts was part of the original team that led this WHO multi-country study on domestic violence against women, and then went on to be the chief scientist at FCDO, amongst other high-flying things. But they had just finished the WHO multi-country study at this time, so there was lots of amazing new data to analyze. So my postdoc was using that data to look at women's experiences of violence and suicide outcomes. So that was really interesting research-wise, and I also learned a lot about the kind of business of doing research. I think in my PhD, I got lots of great methodological training, but the part about, okay, now we have to apply for grants, then network and do all of these things that actually make this all tick over. I learned a lot from Charlotte about that. Okay, so now I'm going to pause so I don't get through my whole talk about violence without defining violence, and just define violence. And then we're going to go into some more research results. So I feel like this particular audience, your department does loads of work on this, so we don't have to spend too much time on it. But here's a few kind of standard definitions about what violence is from WHO and various other agencies. So we are talking about the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, a group or community, that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment or deprivation, etc., etc. And I'm sure everyone knows we usually kind of operationalize this around 4 or 5 common forms of violence. Can I throw to the audience and ask people to just shout out maybe common forms of violence? Great. Anyone want to hazard a guess on number 5? Neglect. Well, maybe there's 6. Financial, economic. Yeah. I'm also thinking about exploitation, which is included in the WHO definition, but one we tend to not look at necessarily in combination with the other forms. But Good work. Okay. So I've spent a lot of my career working on intimate partner violence against women, gender-based violence. I don't particularly like this term, which is probably controversial, but we could talk about that later. So I've spent a lot of my career working on this and a lot of time also working on violence against children. So I am going to tell you about, again, this is like after my postdoc, this was the first kind of proper work project I did on violence. And this was, again, through Charlotte at the London School. We got involved with the Global Burden of Disease study. Is that familiar to people? Yeah. Yes, no one used to know what it was, but now everyone knows what it is. It's reassuring. So this was back in kind of 2008, 2009. And at that time, the Global Burden, they were producing their first estimates around intimate partner violence against women. So it was going to be included in that exercise for the first time. And so Charlotte was co-chairing the expert group, and I was the person who was like doing all of the doing of the stuff, which was a mammoth amount of work. So our job as part of that project was to first look at the global prevalence of intimate partner violence, and then also look at the health effects. So what's associated with partner violence and how much of that is causal. So to do that, we did loads and loads and loads of systematic reviews, which I know I don't, again, have to talk to anyone here about because your department also produces loads of great systematic reviews. But everybody knows very well how much work those are. So what we did in this series of reviews was first look at the prevalence. And we came up with this figure of 30%. So this was based on all kind of geographically representative studies that existed globally at the time. It was women's lifetime experience of physical and or sexual violence from a partner. And it was a modeling study. So we took estimates from the actual data and then kind of projected that to reflect the prevalence in the world's population in 2010. So the number that we came out with was this 30% figure, which was a huge shock to people at the time. Got a lot of press. It was like my most famous high-profile piece of research ever. We got written up in the Metro, which was the free newspaper that you get on the tube in London. Little tiny, tiny, like 3 lines. But I was like, wow, people are paying attention to us. So that was quite exciting. But yeah, people were really shocked at this figure. And at the time, there was a lot of skepticism. We got a lot of weird hate mail from random people who were just like, this is not a thing. What are you doing? What about the men? Yeah. But yeah, that figure now, when I think it's really kind of pervaded public consciousness. And when you ask a lot of people, they will say, oh yeah, it's 1 in 3. WHO and colleagues have updated this figure now for the year 2020, I believe the projection was, and actually it's not changed much at all. That 30% though was masking lots of regional variation. So we did it by WHO region, and you can see in high income countries, 23% of women would have experienced partner violence. And that was ranging up to like 37% across WHO, Africa, Southeast Asia. So quite a lot of regional variation. And when you look at the smaller global burden regions, there's even more variation. So this was also, I think, quite interesting and exciting at the time, because I think it says that, well, violence is a problem everywhere, but also that it's not inevitable. And there is something going on that is driving this regional variation. and we don't really know what it is. And I'm not sure, actually, again, 10 years on, that we are that much further along in understanding what's causing those really big regional differences. Okay. So our other suite of systematic reviews was looking at the health effects of violence exposure. And so this also resulted in quite a high-profile series of publications, because in a lot of cases, it was the first time the evidence had actually been kind of thoroughly reviewed. So we found women exposed to partner violence were twice as likely to experience incident depression, twice as likely to have alcohol use disorders, more likely to have low birth weight babies, had higher odds of acquiring various STIs, and also were more likely to, or there's a high proportion of women who would experience injuries as well. And the figures on homicide also they got a lot of press. That paper was led by Heidi Stockel, who was also from this department. So she looked at homicide data globally and found that for women, 38% of all murders of women were committed by an intimate partner. And for men, the corresponding figure was 6%. So quite stark results. So that was about 6 years of my life. And then I was thinking, what can we do about all of this? So all of those statistics do paint quite a dire picture. And I think for me, I was, very ready to do something other than a systematic review. It's like time for a new methodology. But then, wanting to actually try to help solve the problem. So again, I have Charlotte to thank for this, although I slightly question her judgment, but there was a job going in Uganda to help out with a trial of an intervention called SASA, which is quite famous in the violence against women field, but it's a community mobilization intervention to actually prevent violence. And she hired me to go and help coordinate this, despite the fact that at the time I had never even been to sub-Saharan Africa. So she took a big gamble. And I moved to Uganda, where I was based for the next couple of years. And so I coordinated this trial, which was based around Kampala. And that was one of the first, that trial had quite mixed results, I would say. But it was interesting because it was one of the first tests of whether an intervention like that could operate beyond its direct recipients and have effects kind of at a broader community level. Okay. So during my time in Kampala, I was based at a wonderful NGO called Raising Voices. And I just want to acknowledge here a few of my very important research partners there. Deepak Nagar, who is the co-founder of Raising Voices and oversaw all their violence against children work until a few years ago. And Janet Nakuti, who's still there and who is a senior person on their kind of learning team. And so I've been partnering now with these two and have been mentored by them for probably 15 years now across multiple different studies. And I've learned quite a lot from them. And really, through sitting at Raising Voices, so I went there to coordinate this violence against women work. But while I was there, they asked me to help evaluate some of their violence against children work as well. And that's how I sort of changed course a little bit from looking at women to also being really interested in children. So that's where I've spent now the past 10 or so years of my career, is much more focused on children. Probably you guys have seen this figure before, but when we're thinking about violence against children, the big headline statistic is that about 1 billion children will experience a form of violence every year. But I don't know how you guys feel about this statistic. I think people are often very skeptical of it because it's very big, and it obscures a lot of really important kind of variation. So both the forms of violence that children experience and the settings where they experience it vary quite a lot by age. And I think, yeah, curious to hear from others, but to me, I think if you look at the kind of landscapes of interventions in the field to address violence, they don't really match kind of the epidemiology of that violence. And I think there's a really heavy emphasis on what happens at home, which is good and needed, but correspondingly less emphasis on what happens in other environments that kids spend a lot of time in. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on it. So yeah, I became much more interested in violence against children. And one of the first projects I did on that was in partnership with Raising Voices. And so it was helping them to evaluate an intervention called the Good School Toolkit, which is a school-based intervention, as the name would suggest. And it was actually, I think, one of the first ones to be formally evaluated in a trial that was designed to address violence from teachers to children, in addition to violence between children. And that one, the intervention itself is a whole school approach, which we think is one of the reasons why it's successful, because it's engaging multiple kind of different actors from within the school. So head teachers, and students, and then everybody's kind of going through this process of change together. So that trial showed quite a large intervention effect. So that was also quite exciting. And that particular study has fed into, along with lots and lots of other work, the INSPIRE guidance for how to prevent violence against children, and it's in various other guidance documents that are out and about. So for me, after doing that work, I was like, okay, yes, this is what I want to do. This is where my main interest lies. And I guess my kind of research group grew out from there. So this is we call ourselves very creatively the Child Protection Research Group at the London School. And this is our current team. So we are sort of at any given time, and depending on funding, in between like 5 and 15 people. And that's staff and also PhD students. And so with this group of colleagues, we are continuing to do a lot of work across the spectrum of child protection and violence prevention. So we're very interested in violence in schools, also childhood sexual abuse, and a range of other things. And we use varying methodological approaches. So we do a lot of trials of different prevention strategies. We do research thinking about causes and consequences of violence. And then we do research on the ethics and safety aspects. And Ami, I used to be on that board, but now she's moved here. Yeah, so you guys probably also recognize some of the other Anya who works here, but she's a PhD student with our group, and Emily Eldred as well, who have been around. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to bring you guys through like the sort of 3 buckets of research that our group does now. And then I'm hoping we can talk a bit about future directions and good ideas for stuff that we need to do in the field. So yeah, thinking about our work, the first kind of bucket of it is sort of discovery research. So that is thinking about the causes of violence and the consequences of it in such a way that we can inform intervention development. So we know already violence in childhood has a really large range of effects, but the studies that we have on this are often methodologically of questionable quality. And it's often really hard to disentangle the effects of early childhood violence from other factors that are co-occurring in early childhood. So we are interested, and we use various kind of causal inference methodologies to try and understand and quantify the causes and the consequences of violence. And so there's I've tried to put up a few different topic and a few different methodological examples. So we use cohort data often to do this. And within the group, we've got a largish cohort study in Uganda where we've been following about 3,500 people over their adolescence. And that's got 3 waves of data collection. So we're using that to explore some of these pathways. And then we're also doing kind of work on various different topics around climate change, around educational outcomes, and so on. And then one other area, which is new-ish for me, but I'm finding really interesting, and is in partnership with a few different PhD students and colleagues at Birkbeck, is around mapping and doing geospatial analysis around some of the patterns that we see in violence distribution. I think it's become quite clear from a lot of these very big global modeling efforts around prevalence that there is a huge amount of regional variation. So by region, by country, within countries, and it doesn't seem to be fully explained by the kind of distribution of existing risk factors. So yeah, understanding what's going on there, I think, is really interesting. And I'm hoping can provide some window into maybe undiscovered causes of violence. That's the dream. We'll see if we get there. So this is kind of some of the stuff that we're working on these days. The second and probably largest bucket of work that we do is is quite applied. So it's testing interventions to prevent violence. And all of this work is in very close collaboration with partners. So we tend to be people who are coming to partner to help evaluate something rather than people who develop an intervention and then evaluate it. So partners are mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and also more recently Latvia. And this has included a lot of school-based work, also with community health workers and formal child protection services. And we've also done a little bit of work with the people who actually collect the data. So we did a trial of strategies to reduce secondary distress in violence researchers as well. So lots and lots of different intervention work going on. And then the third bucket of stuff that we do is much more methodologically focused. And for me, I think this is one of the most important aspects of this work, and is sort of what I'm giving a nod to in the title of my talk. Because when we ask about violence, people will tell us about their experiences, and very often in a research interview, that might be the first time that they've disclosed this information. And so, we have a responsibility, I think, to receive that information sensitively and to act on it appropriately. And especially when we're working with children, we often also have like a legal obligation to act on it appropriately. So yeah, doing this type of work, especially in contexts where the kind of systems to respond to disclosures are very under-resourced, is really, really tricky. So what we try to do is kind of nest questions around different methods to deal with this into our applied work. So yeah, we've done a number of different types of exercises, kind of thinking through the ethics and safety aspects of doing this work. Okay, that marks the point when I stop talking. And now we'll hopefully turn it over to you guys. So yeah, thanks for listening to that whistle-stop tour through me. But yeah, I can tell you what I'm thinking about in terms of what's interesting to do next and where do we need to go from here. But I would also really love to hear from you guys, your thoughts and reflections, and also any questions about what I've said.